Welcome. You're listening to Dupee Deep with Dr. Nikki. This is the place where witty, irreverent, opinionated perspective meets serious, fact-based discussion. Featuring our host, Dr. Nikki Coleman, and her co-host, Tomas Bell. You can also join in the discussion during our live tapings by following us on Spreaker.com. Now, the doctor is in. It's time to get Dupee Deep.
Hello, hello, hello. How is everyone out there on this fine podcast Friday? We want to welcome you back. The we being me, Dr. Nikki, and Tomas. You all ready to go.
That's right.
I was really shocked. I'm sorry. I overspoke. Why don't you go ahead and try that again?
We are mid-season 2. I've finally got my cues together. I finally created a cue sheet, right? So, yes, we are ready to go.
So today we're going to talk about #luxuriate. I love that word.
So do I. And I love to do it. Right.
So I'm sure you do. The first time I actually heard the word luxuriate was from you, and I was like we were in conversation, and you said it, and I was like, I don't really think in my mind I was like, I don't think that's a word. Like, I don't think you can verbalize. Like,
please understand that intersection of black and gay. English is a creative tool, baby.
As it is, because as soon as I said, I don't really think you could do that, but I'm going to go with it and use it henceforth, was the next thought that came through. So we're going to talk about #luxuriate today. In seriousness, I want to talk about this hot concept that I hear people talking about so much. And I think that some people are misinterpreting what it means and misusing it, and maybe using it as an excuse to avoid certain other things. But I want to talk about self-care. Self-care Sundays, self-care Saturdays. You know, people have made this a thing.
Right.
It's a term that I hear pretty much in all of my circles. And I have to be honest that there's a larger proportion of mental health professionals and psychologists in my circles, so that might have something to do with it. But I do think that it has reached a level of kind of mainstream popularity. And I also think that sometimes it is misused, that people are labeling activities and behaviors as self-care, almost like a euphemism, but it's not actually self-care.
Saturday.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
I'm going to get this bubble bath. Self-care Sunday.
Self-care Friday, right. Is that really self-care? Or should you just be cleaning yourself regularly anyway? Like, that's, hygiene Monday. I don't know.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Right.
Hygiene.
At least 3 to 4 days throughout the week, at least.
My general rule is that more days of the week than not, I need to immerse myself in some water.
I concur.
Just the basics. So I want to start off by sharing a quote from one of my favorite sheroes. I think maybe I've mentioned her before in here. Maybe I've quoted her before or not. I'm not sure. But Audrey Lourde is one of my favorite sheroes.
Yes,
and she said,
about her before.
Okay, that's what I thought. Probably because I love her. She's amazing. She says, quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare," end quote. I really love this quote because I think it is a true embodiment of what self-care is intended to be. I think self-care is particularly important for people that represent marginalized groups, in the sense that oftentimes our needs, perspectives, values, contributions, et cetera, aren't always acknowledged or appreciated and rarely celebrated in the mainstream. And so we have to be able to find ways to do that for ourselves and to be able to take care of ourselves in the process. of simply being in a context in which we're not always welcomed or appreciated or valued. So when I hear people use okay, let me ask you this, Tomas. When people say self-care, what do you think that it means? Like, what does the word mean to you?
Well, having an intersection in the wellness community, I would think it is.
Here we go, Mr.
You asked. You asked. And ask and thou shalt receive. Not necessarily yoga, though, I'm all about getting my ohm on, but meditation, yoga, just practicing a pause, practicing a breath, doing things for you, to the benefit of you, speaking to a mental health professional, speaking to a friend to help you work through things, anything that you do to center yourself. And I think that's important. That's how I will use self-care. I look at it as centering, coming back to who you are, putting yourself first, focusing on taking care of you. That's self-care to me. Okay.
So I think that is a more comprehensive and probably a little bit more, I'm going to use the word mature definition than sometimes what I've encountered. And I also hear in your definition some blending of ideas that are really separate, but people make them one. And so one is separating out self-care from self-soothing.
Right.
And
to me, self-soothing, I would put that in the category of sort of stress relief. And it's okay to sort of like getting a massage, I would call self-soothing. I wouldn't necessarily call it self-care. Dealing with the things that brought you to the point to need the massage, I would put in the self-care. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a really good distinction. And I'm not sure that everybody always makes that distinction. So I do think that the self-soothing is a component of self-care. And self-care is more than that. So when I use the word self-care, whether I'm directing it towards myself actually, or when I'm talking with other folks, I'm thinking specifically about a set of intentional activities or behaviors that serve to reinforce compassion, gentleness, care, and concern for the self. So that's a pretty broad and global kind of phrasing. I think for me, the way that I like to kind of distill it down and think about it is that it is a practice that in its essence is an intentional attending to and reaffirmation of our humanity. So last time we talked a lot about kind of role overload and how we're all trying to be too many things all the time.
Right.
And so for me, I think that is why we've seen this increase in our conversation and mainstream conversation about self-care, because I think people really are feeling the stress and overload of trying to be all of those things and present well in doing all of those things. And so self-care has come up, I think, as a little bit of an offset to that, which I think is kind of ironic. Like, why don't we just change the overall context and conversation so we don't have to be so consumed with self-care? Right. And let's think about how we could pare down and reduce overall. But the part about self-care that I don't think that people always talk about is that it can sometimes look like you intentionally engaging in behaviors that might not be immediately pleasurable. And I think that that's where the conversation has gone wrong. So when we think about self-soothing, those things, I think you use the word centering or grounding or something like that, and thinking about self-soothing as something that you do as a more immediate reaction to stress, I think that's great. I think that you developing a set of activities, things that you do that bring you back to that calm, bring you back to center, helps you manage acute stress in a very specific amount of time. I think that's a wonderful skill to have. At the same time, that in and of itself is insufficient. And so we want to think about self-care as being bigger than that. So that can sometimes mean setting and maintaining important relationship boundaries. It can sometimes mean knowing when to ask for help or support. It can sometimes look like setting self-imposed limits on things. It can sometimes look like following through on commitments. And it can sometimes, and really I think a lot of times looks like holding yourself accountable. And that's the part of the conversation that I'm not always hearing when we talk about self-care.
And to all of our listeners today, or whatever day you're listening to this beautiful thing called a podcast, listen, pull out your notebooks, because I pulled out mine when she started talking about boundaries and setting those appropriate. Because, you know, you're so right. Oftentimes, we're taught that being selfless is a good thing, and being selfish and narcissistic is a bad thing, and it's all mixed and connotated as, oh, you're a selfish person. You don't give out. You don't take care of people. Blah 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 blah. But sometimes taking care of other people means you're not taking care of yourself. And Absolutely. Why is it a bad thing to take care of yourself? Why have we been sold this bill of goods?
So, you know, I do give some thought to that. Let me say, part of this conversation, I'm speaking with my psychologist hat on, and there's another part of me that understands it from my personal experience is also thinking about it from the lens of me being a Black woman. And I think some of this is generational baggage that's been passed on to people, different ways of thinking about yourself in the world. Right. That you've been modeled, like that has been modeled to you, and so you've been socialized to be around, and to the extent that it looks like if you care about me, then you will do these things in disregard of your own needs.
I'm sorry.
Ahead.
No, I was just going to say to that, I am who I am today because I saw who my grandmother was. Mm-hmm. I saw who my mother is, or I see who my mother is, excuse me. So it's me taking the time now to break certain patterns that worked for them, but really didn't work for them, right?
Right.
But now I'm the bad person because I'm the person who's saying, no, this is your responsibility. You need to handle your responsibility. I need to take care of my own. But I'm the bad person. So, yeah, I completely understand. And it's not just generational. It's also cultural. Because in certain communities, you know, you become the black sheep if you don't follow along with what everyone else is doing.
You become the outcast. Let's use that language and not use racially charged negative language like black sheep. Let me help you with your own verbiage today on that. Couldn't let that one slide.
Ashe,
let me tell you something.
Ashe.
If you cold, that black sheep's wool is just as good as the white sheep.
And as a person who usually only wears black clothing, I would mess with that black wool before the white wool anyway.
Right, anyway. So let's just check our.
Oh my goodness, that's a show. We got to do a show about that because when you said, I was like, that's right. That's why I don't use words like picnic and things like that because there's so much implicit racism in this freaking world. My goodness.
Exactly. Which goes back to my point. And I think part of Audrey Lourde's point, right? That caring for yourself is not an act of self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And I do think that I think self-care is a different conversation for certain folks, depending on communities that they are part of because of longstanding social political histories of oppression, existing experiences around oppression that are more and more direct and explicit and treacherous these days than they have been for generations for lots of folks. And so I'm not discounting at all. As a mental health professional,